Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to present a special fireside chat on foreign direct investments in the Adria. This engaging discussion will feature insights from Aleksandra Njagulj, founding partner at Sustineri Partners, and Rikard Scoufias, chairman of HEREMA. Together, they will explore the nuances and strategies of attracting and managing foreign direct investments in our region, highlighting the critical role these investments play in advancing sustainable development. Please join us for what promises to be an enlightening conversation filled with expert perspectives on enhancing economic growth through sustainable investments.
Rikard, you've been dealing with large infrastructure projects, always with foreign investment, right, throughout your career. And in the past decade or so, you've been focusing on Adria region, Mediterranean. Now, I am from Adria region and I come back, I live in London now, but I come back every now and then, and I see transformation happening, and I think it's going well, and we heard some nice examples from yesterday. From your perspective, from global experience and experience in the region, is the transformation to the scale and the speed that you need happening? What's your impression? Is it going to happen?
It is definitely going to happen because it's inevitable. Is it happening? I think absolutely. I think the fact that we are here for the second year in a row and looking at the interest across government, industry, civil society, and all the enthusiasm in the room. And now, as you said, we need to maintain that enthusiasm as well before lunch. But I think it's definitely happening. From an investment perspective, I think that the region is actually quite ideally placed. There is a lot of investment capital sloshing around in the world at the moment, looking for a home. It doesn't necessarily want to be in the US. It doesn't necessarily want to be in Western Europe because the yields are not very big, so it's sort of polishing the last percentages. As it looks around the world, there are certain areas which are more complicated due to political influence and geopolitical influence. There are some areas in the world which are very complex from a governance perspective, broadly governance perspective. And if you look at this region, I think this region is ideally placed. There is a need, there is significant opportunities. The region, of course, has its own complexities. It recognizes its own complexities. The need for reform is often coming up. But I also think that if you look at the EU's growth plan for the Western Balkans, there is projected a doubling of the economies over the next 10 years. If you look at some of the growth plans for the broader Adria region, it's a little bit more muted, but the expectations are very high, and particularly in some of these areas, whereas I am personally actively engaged in energy integration, in the energy transition, etc. And I think this is not just now theoretical. I think we have seen a lot of programs and processes in the last couple of years that's really moved the ball forward. So I'm really optimistic.
So we heard about all these great examples. This is how you do it. People. There's government support. There is the will. There is an interest. There is financing sloshing around. We have some examples from the region, but are they to the scale, so even larger scale? The TAP project that you've worked on, I think, is the scale that we're talking about. Huge projects. Could you tell us how you went about that and how that happened?
Yeah, I think it is certainly a project of scale. The TAP project in itself, so to give you an idea, sort of this came up as a brainchild because Europe realized that we need to diversify our energy dependence. Up until recently, Europe brought its energy from the North Sea, which is sort of in a decline curve, from North Africa, which is a complex region, and from Russia, which is now a very complex partner for Europe. So the whole notion was to create a fourth energy corridor. There's huge energy resources in the Caspian region. We need to bring this into Europe. The overall project here that we're talking about, this Southern Gas Corridor, as it's called, is at a time, I don't know if it is still today, was the world's largest industrial project, valued at about $55 billion project. TAP was a part of this, and I had the opportunity to lead in TAP in Greece, and then the project also went through Albania, Greece, into Italy. But I think it's a good example because it talks about the magnitude, but I think what is more relevant here maybe than the magnitude is the content of the project. So when I joined TAP in 2011, we had a very, very, very challenging situation with stakeholders. We had a very challenging situation with the government. It was outright hostile, to be honest. We needed to deliver a turnaround. This was essentially my briefing. And the ESG and sustainability aspect of this was absolutely the critical linchpin. We had to completely rethink how did we approach our interaction with government, how did we approach our interaction with affected communities, with stakeholders, with civil society. I will be happy to discuss it over lunch, but I'm not going to do it all now. But just result to say that a big project in the region, we ended up, I like data, we ended up with 95% approval. And it's a project, I think, that plays...
approval, you got the money, right? So we have all of this financing sloshing around, people desperate to make investments. You've got the government on your side. Happy days, right? This is improving the infrastructure of the country for the betterment of the country. What else? I mean, done, right? You know, my father is a civil engineer. He's been building bridges all his life. He never talked about public approval to build a bridge. You know, why is that becoming such an important topic then? Is, you know, social license to operate?
Because that's where we get it wrong.
All right.
Because when it comes to these big projects, and I've had the opportunity to work a number of them, and most of them were troublesome. I would like to point out for the record that they were troublesome before I joined. They were less troublesome, hopefully, after I joined. The guys who create the financial structures, they rarely get it wrong. The engineers, difficult breed of people as they are to interact with, they do know how to do things, so they don't get it wrong. Where these projects fail is in the interaction with the real people, the people that are affected. So this is sort of part of what we're discussing. So rather than just making general observations, let me give you some fascinating statistics. If we look globally at mega projects, so a mega project is a project that we define as something worth more than $1 billion, which nowadays isn't that much money anymore. 40% of these projects run into trouble. And those trouble are non-financial and they're non-technical. They are non-technical or non-financial problems. So basically, they're people problems. 40% run into trouble. The magnitude of those troubles will range from getting a delay for a couple of weeks all the way to getting thrown out by the government, the project is declared, is not going to happen, and the whole thing collapses. On average, that represents, on average, 30% of the value of a project. So actually, if you do some simple arithmetics, 40% of 30%, my math is still with me, is about 12%. So getting this right, getting the interaction with the people that we affect right, is on average worth 12% of capex. So if I'm running a $3 billion project, this is worth somewhere between 350 and 400 million euros. And I reflect on that. I was listening to one of the previous panels, and I think it was a very, very good conversation, and somebody made the reference, you know, we're launching these ESG programs, and I really hope that we can get some funding for it. I often work with people, ESG experts, and I say, well, you have to go to your executive leadership and you have to tell them that unless you get the funding for it, unless you get your meager whatever it's going to be, they are actually putting 12% of capex, notwithstanding the goodwill value and the reputation of the company, at risk. So yes, I emphasize this because this is nowadays what I think the critical failure point, and we keep seeing these problems.
Yeah, I see it actually in my backyard, as it were. So there is, where I live in London, Earl's Court development project, which got derailed. So they had support, even the land, from the two local councils, so Hammersmith and Fulham and Kensington and Chelsea. They had all the financing in the world, pension funds, very rich. So they had, best architects, best designers, everything was done right. What they didn't count on was the social housing tenants who organized and completely trashed the entire project. The company went bankrupt, and now they're starting, trying to restart again by bringing those people in. So, the power of community actually is often neglected. So how do you go about it? How do you bring communities on board?
I think by really meaning it when I say the word inclusive. Inclusive is one of these words that we love to say. We are incredibly inclusive, but when it comes down to it, we're actually not very inclusive. Oftentimes when we have these conversations, we tend to forget to bring the people in. In my grandparents' generation, I think that was accepted. My grandfather would see the world very much from a us and them perspective. They were the big people with the money makers and the big projects, etc., and they were them. Today, people don't accept this anymore. I think there's a number of various factors here. I think generally speaking, the awareness of these issues that we are debating is much higher, particularly among young generations. They know what's happening. They know what's going on. Sometimes their energy is being co-opted, and that's very sad to see. So they go out and protest for all the wrong reasons, but I've always said I'd rather have a teenager out screaming in the streets for the wrong reasons than having them sitting home not caring and playing computer games. But there is an awareness that is there, which means that expectations are higher and stakes are higher.
And the trust is lower.
The trust is lower, and I think this is something that particularly affects us in this region. My background is Swedish. We tend to believe things. So we have a society where we always have we presume the good until proven wrong. I'm also half Greek. My Greek relatives tend to be the other way around. They would rather sort of presume the worst until proven right. And there's, of course, a good reason for this, because if we look in the Mediterranean region, in the Balkan region, a lot of these big investments that we are talking about, they actually haven't been executed in the best fashion in the past. So this is not people being suspicious. This is people having learned from bad experiences. They know that you are not going to reinstate the land. You're not going to pay me fairly for my land. If I have to go through this process, it's going to be very long in court. So there is a big trust deficit that we need to get through. And as to this inclusiveness, what we often do is we come in and then we start lecturing people. We don't listen to people. We're not very inclusive. We start lecturing. We're telling them how we're going to do things, and we're telling them that this is going to be the best thing.
This is good for you.
This is good for you. And people say, well, it doesn't feel good to me. We don't have that value proposition. We often fail in presenting a value proposition. People do things, in my mind, because either they see a value of doing things or they see a drawback of not doing things. So we need to explain that value proposition. I mean, look, let me give you an example. When we were building the previous project that you referred to, we of course did an environmental and social impact assessment where we made an assessment what impact we were going to have on the environment and on people. And we were predominantly Scandinavia's business leaders and German engineers. We then went out to the communities. We didn't have to, but we conducted about 400 meetings where we said to people, this is what we have identified, but we don't live here. You have a better understanding than us. What have you identified as potential risks and opportunities? And they told us. And actually, we came a long way by just listening, and more importantly, by showing that we were listening. So we made over 120 adjustments to the routing of a pipeline. No, let me pause it for a second, because we all have this prejudice about, big business. The world's largest industrial endeavor, worth 55 billion euros, made over 100 route changes because we were advised by little guys that I was going to build a well there. Could you possibly move this 20 meter north? And at the time we could. So I think that came a long way. And as I said, it was one of those critical success factors that then led us having over 90% support from our communities. And of course, when we have that level of support from the communities, we also have very good support from the political class, because the voters were happy, the politicians were happy. So, yeah.
And the investors are happy.
And the investors were happy because
they didn't lose the 12%.
In our case, that 12% would have been about 260 million. As a matter of fact, I wanted to develop a big community investment program because I realized that, remember, this was during the crisis years in Greece as well. A lot of people were really having a very, very difficult time. It's almost hard today to fathom how challenging it was for many of the communities. We wanted to make a big investment, and I wanted to have money for this. That's the way the world goes round. I needed money. So I needed to go back to my board. I was thinking about this today in the previous presentation. Somebody said, I wanted to have money for my ESG and community initiatives. So did I, and I wanted to have a lot of money. I wanted to have 32 million euros to invest in community activities. And I suspect that if I had gone and asked for this amount of money on the basis of philanthropic commitment, I would not have had $32 million. When I went to the board and I said to them, this is my reading of the risk landscape, do you agree? Once they said, yes, we do agree that this is a reasonable assessment of the risk landscape, then I said, good, so that risk landscape is about 280 million. I can offset this risk if you give me 32 million. So basically, I'll give you $10 on the dollar. And we executed this program, and it actually worked out.
And this is what we mean when we say, okay, well, you need to embed ESG in your actual business operation. It is not a CSR exercise. It's not, to use the horrible word greenwashing exercise. It needs to be embedded, and when it's embedded, it brings value. So there is work for ESG people to do. That's great. They have a mortgage to pay. So that's excellent news. So just very shortly, because there is, I work globally as well, and there is this backlash, especially from the US, not only to ESG, also D&I, all of these woke initiatives. What you were talking about is pure business sense, right? It's not being woke. It's, making business happen. So how in the ESG world then we contest that backlash? Do we, simply go away, or do we lay down and let them get over us? How do we fight that the best?
Look, I think the ESG debate also needs to change. In some respects, I can be critical. I prefer not to be, because I think we have come a long way. But I think it's important to sort of scrape on the surface and be quite realistic about this. There was a time when the general consensus was ESG is fantastic, it generates lots of revenue, and then we had all the big financial entities jumping into this. They were from a financial background. They did not necessarily understand all of the socioeconomic, environmental, and sociocultural components of this, so they needed somewhere to hang their hat on. So as they were sort of looking around for somewhere to hang the hat, there were people who were very, very happy to fill that with ESG standards. It's a good fix. I'm supposed to give risk capital to somebody. I know ESG is important. I don't know really if this is good or bad, but if you can tell me that you have, if you can tell me that you adhere to certain standards, you've passed test. I'm not hitting down too hard on that because I think that was a necessary step. I think we needed to get there to socialize the concept. But of course, as many of you will know, particularly those of you who are sort of responsible for ensuring that you are complying with these standards, at last count last year, there were now over 600 different ESG standards that you could comply with, which basically means that you had a free rein to do whatever you want because there was guaranteed to be a standard that you were complying with. So I think there is a big shift happening, and I personally think that a lot of this landscape is actually going to branch out into two separate branches. I think on the one hand, we will have a compliance branch. We will see more and more of these voluntary standards becoming codified into legislation. I see on the front row that we have some experts who are, here, deep experts on how to navigate that increasing complexity. But this also means that some of these will move into a compliance and sort of legal people will deal with this. I think it's very natural. If I can be allowed just to make one observation, I did not know this until recently, but until the Great Depression in the US in the 20s, there was actually no commonly agreed accounting standards. So companies could present their financial accounting and reporting whichever way they wanted. And of course, they did it in a way that looked really good until we had a total collapse in the Great Depression. Then the American Institute of Accountants and subsequently the SEC realized, I think we need to have some rules around this, otherwise we don't know who's faking it, etc. I'm pretty convinced that 20 years from now, my daughter is going to look back at what we are doing today and say, that when my dad was dealing with this, there was no ESG standards. People could do whatever they wanted, and they just presented stories, and it was absolutely crazy, greenwashing. So I think we're going to have a compliance side. But I think we're also going to have another side, which is the one that really excites me. And this is what I call the impact side. Where people say, look, there is a basic level that you need to comply with, otherwise you don't get to play.
Yeah.
But you're still going to compete. So the other side is really about the impact side, which is what impacts do I have as a business? How am I going to manage these impacts in a way that protects my stakeholder value, but also my shareholder value? And it has to be both, because that is the economic model that we have created. Those companies that come up with the smartest ways and the most innovative ways of managing their impacts are going to be the companies that are going to lead tomorrow. And what makes this, in my mind, incredibly exciting is this is no longer a question of just having deep pockets. This is not only about being able to throw millions or billions at a problem, it's about a mindset. It's about getting you people, essentially, the most experienced and innovative ESG and sustainability experts into the room and come up with the solutions that are going to say, this is not going to cost us a lot of money, it's going to cost us a lot of brain capital, but if we do this, it's a little bit like John said, this can start in a garage almost. You don't need the capital, but the one who comes out with the biggest and smartest solution, the extractive company that comes out with the smartest business model that really plows money back into the communities, is going to be the company that's going to leapfrog ahead of the competition. That doesn't happen under normal circumstances. This only happens at time of paradigm shift. And that's where we are today. This is exactly where we are, and we're people like you. I'm not supposed to say this, but as you know, Sasha recently got a pretty impressive award as one of the ESG leaders. This is the area where we need people coming out and saying, this is how we're going to do it. So
I promise
all of us,
he was not paid to say this.
Yeah.
But we will, I think, I'm going to stop you there. Awards sometimes look better than they are. Getting an award in Cannes was always my idea was that I'm going to get an award for a film, but I'll take what I can. Anyway, I think this is really inspirational, really exciting. It's good news that ESG continues to be good news for the business. And even better news is that we are done and we are going to have a lovely break in the sun now with lunch. So thank you so much for your attention. Thank you for your time. I know this was a big sacrifice.
Thank you, Nadia.